Philosophy Department seminar, COVID edition online. Thank you all for coming. In as much as we can understand the notion of coming and going when we're all more or less at home. We are very happy to welcome Professor Caspar Hare from MIT, who works on practical rationality, ethics, and metaphysics, and is currently working on a book project, Living in a Strange World, drawing connections between metaphysics, between all of these three areas, I understand. And today, Professor Hare will be speaking to us on the title, Pleasing the Crowd with It. Thank you very much and welcome, Professor Hare.
Hello, great. So thank you so much, Max, and thank you for inviting me. It's great in some sense of to be here. Yeah, okay, so I'll just get started. Okay, so yeah, I'll talk about my book project, and then what we're going to do today is talk about part 2 of my book. Okay, so if you could pull up the hand up in front of you. So the big idea behind the book project is that is this. So start off with physicists saying some very odd, strange things. So I remember when I was young, when I was first blown away by an idea in cosmology I was blown away by the idea that there was no up in space. So if you imagine the Earth with like the North Pole up, and then imagine the Earth with the North Pole down, and then you imagine the Earth sort of on its side with as if like suspended on a piece of string, you know, on an axle. None of those imaginative activities is any more accurate or correct than any other. And I remember finding this very destabilizing. It was my first exposure to physics being strange. And really, as I learned more and more about physics and cosmology, these sort of surprises kept coming and coming. So some physicists say that we live in a chaotic world. We should say roughly that we live in a system such that tiny changes earlier in the system have a systematic tendency to amplify and become big macro changes later. Some physicists say that the space that we live in is finite, has finite volume. So it's as if we're living on the 3-dimensional surface of a 4-dimensional donut. So I'm right now pointing at the back of my head. I'm also pointing at the back of my head if I go here, and I'm also pointing at the back of my head. Wherever I point, I'm pointing at the back of my head. Other physicists say that space is infinite, has infinite volume. And furthermore, that as events within space get increasingly far apart, they become increasingly probabilistically discorrelated. And the result of that is, if you think about it, that for any degree of physical similarity that you specify, there are more things in our infinite universe. Sorry, there are infinitely many things in our infinite universe that are more similar to you than that are to a lower degree dissimilar to you than that degree you just specified. This is kind of mind-blowing and amazing, but it's a strange thing, and it sort of follows from a well-respected theory in physics. Okay, so putting aside the physicists, metaphysicians, they also say, as we're more familiar with in philosophy, many strange things. So some say that the so-called eternalists say that past, present, and future things all exist. So Joan of Arc exists, my grandchildren exist, as well as me. Some metaphysicians say that everything that exists necessarily. So you could not have failed to exist. You might have failed to like be fleshy, have mass, and so on and so forth, but you're always there. You're always going to be there. Some metaphysicians say that in the vicinity of every person, or indeed every ordinary thing, there are untold gazillions of things very like it. Okay, so the question is, do these things matter? Supposing that the strange theories were true, would that make any difference in the sense of would it change what we ought to believe and desire and do? Now, I should be a bit clearer about that. Obviously, whether or not a theory in physics is true has a bearing on what you ought to believe about physics. And it obviously has a bearing on what you ought to do with your pen if you're taking a physics exam. That's not the kind of question I'm interested in. I'm interested in the question of whether believing that the theory is true has a bearing on what you ought to do in ordinary contexts outside of physics exam, and what you ought to believe about everyday matters seemingly unrelated to physics. That's the question. Okay. And of course, the book would not be very interesting if the answer to that was no. We're going to see that, at least in some cases, I think the answer is yes. But before we get into it, let's go into some methodological preliminaries. So what's going on when you have a big idea in science or metaphysics, and it seems to tell against a sort of commonsensical normative idea, an idea about what we ought to do in an everyday context, or what we ought to believe about an everyday matter. Call the big idea in science and metaphysics B, and the commonsensical normative idea N. So what happens is you have an inconsistent triplet of propositions. You have B, the big idea. You have, is B then not N? That's the linking claim. And then you have N, which is the commonsensical normative idea. And faced with an inconsistent triplet of propositions, basically there are obviously three ways to resolve the inconsistency. Call rejecting B the way of denial. So you reject the big idea in physics, metaphysics. Call rejecting the linking claim the way of accommodation. That's involved rejecting if B then not N. And call rejecting the commonsensical normative idea the way of reform. That involves rejecting N. And it may be helpful also to distinguish between two sorts of rejection. So denial, accommodation, or reform, they can be base, which is where you reject the one idea simply because of its inconsistency with the other two. Or they can be principled, or I think I used the word independent in the handout, where you reject the one idea on principled independent grounds. Okay, so as just to get your heads around the vocabulary and sort of work it out with the case. So suppose I've been eating from Whole Foods. I've been getting Whole Foods Market being the local supermarket here. I've been getting a kind of sausage and having it for breakfast for the last fortnight. And it's been delicious, and it's sort of more gamey and interesting than many Whole Foods sausages. And I like it. And then some news comes in, and the news is that the bacon is dolphin. I'm sorry, not the bacon. The sausage is made out of dolphin. And I'm like, oops, what's going on? Well, I've got, there's a big idea, which is that the sausage is made out of dolphin. There's a linking claim, which is that if the sausage is made out of dolphin, I shouldn't have been eating it. And then there's like a commonsensical normative thing that it was idea, which is that it was fine for me to spend the last fortnight eating this this sausage. Base denial would just be this. It would be to say, it can't be dolphin, because if it were dolphin, then it wouldn't have been okay for me to eat it. Obviously, it was okay for me to do what I did for the last 2 weeks, so it can't be dolphin. That would be base denial. Independent denial would be my going, checking, finding out, given independent evidence that it's not dolphin. Base accommodation would be my saying, this is dolphin. Obviously, what I've done for the last 2 weeks is okay. So I just discovered something interesting, namely that it's okay to eat dolphin. I didn't think that before, but I've made this interesting discovery about normative principles, namely that eating dolphin is okay. Independent accommodation would be something like I've gone and I've read my Peter Singer, and I've discovered that there are all these flaws in the arguments that say that all intelligent species should be respected and not eaten. And so I now reject the idea that if it was dolphin, it wasn't okay to eat it. Finally, base denial would be just saying, oh, I shouldn't have been eating this. And independent denial would be something like, well, I'm not sure whether I should have been eating it, but I've consulted my wise mother, and she told me that I shouldn't have been eating this, so I shouldn't have been eating this. Okay, so that was just to help you get your head around the terminology and the sort of ideas in play here. Now, you may think when I look at that example that clearly the only way to go is base denial, and I'm sorry, base accommodation, and that does seem to be right. Base accommodation, remember, being the view that I'm sorry, the only way to go is base reform, saying that I shouldn't have been eating this. But a curious thing is that if you look into the sort of annals of philosophy, when philosophers have been confronted with inconsistent triads like this, they tend not to go the way of reform. They tend to be more attracted to the ways of denial or accommodation. So on your handout, let's see, got a couple of examples. Okay, so one example. So there's maximizing utilitarianism, which is the view that an action is right, just in case no alternative to it is better, and whether or not one alternative is better than another has to do with it, has a better outcome. Whether or not one outcome is better than another depends on the sum total of pleasure minus pain in the outcome, something like that. So critics of maximizing utilitarianism have frequently pointed out that the theory appears to run into trouble if the world in which we live is infinite, and infinite whatever we do. Suppose the world is infinite, suppose it contains infinitely much suffering, infinitely much pleasure. It appears like nothing we do will increase the sum total of pleasure minus suffering, right? So, so nothing we do is right or wrong. So what have you got here? You've got an inconsistent triad. You've got a big idea, which is the world is infinite. There will always be infinitely much suffering and infinitely much pleasure, whatever we do. You've got a linking claim, which is just given by maximizing utilitarianism, which says, if there will always be infinitely much suffering and infinitely much pleasure, whatever we do, then nothing we ever do is right or wrong. And then you've got a common sense normative claim that some things we do are right or wrong. Look at Jack the Ripper. He did some things that were wrong. Look at Hitler. He did some things that were wrong, so on and so forth. So in response to this, utilitarians and indeed everybody has thought that the thing to do was just to reject the linking claim, to accommodate. So for the utilitarians, it was a matter of trying to develop a version of utilitarianism that just deems some infinite world better than others, maybe using some kind of dominance principles. So they and their critics and everybody here, in response to this kind of problem, is just committed to some kind of base accommodation. Again, that's pretty much par for the course. I'll use one further example, a little bit more elaborate. So if you're familiar with David Lewis and modal realism, which is the view roughly that for every way our world could have been, there is a world that is that way. Critics of modal realism, right from the start, and it's kind of gone on, pointed out that if the theory was true, that would seem to render concern for strangers sort of perverse, pointless, not worth our time. Why is that? that's because, if I discover that there may or may not have been a famine on the other side of the world to me, a bunch of people I didn't know have suffered, there's something of which I'm ignorant, whether or not there's all this suffering. According to modal realism, the pluriverse in which we all live contains every imaginable kind of suffering within it. And for there to be, in the ordinary sense of to be, no suffering, when I say, oh, I hope there have been no suffering, what am I hoping? I'm really hoping that I'm not spatio-temporally connected to the suffering. So a desire that strangers not suffer amounts to a desire that I not be spatio-temporally connected to any suffering strangers. Well, the pluriverse is full of suffering strangers, whatever happens, but there not being suffering strangers consists, in the ordinary sense of be, consists in suffering strangers not being spatio-temporally connected to me. But why bother caring about whether or not I'm spatio-temporally connected to suffering strangers? It seems their suffering is no better or worse for me being spatio-temporally connected to them or not. It doesn't seem like my grounds for caring about stranger suffering have anything to do with their relation to me. Now, you can think this is a good objection or a bad objection. That's the kind of form of the objection. And notice that you can just frame this as the objector is drawing attention to another inconsistent triad. The big idea is Lewis's idea that modal realism is true. The linking claim is that if modal realism is true, then you shouldn't care about stranger starvation, or at least it's not the case that you should care about stranger starvation. And the commonsensical normative idea is you should care about stranger starvation. And it was presented as an objection to modal realism. So the critics were saying, confronted with this triad, you should go in for some base denial. You should reject B. Lewis, of course, as you remember if you read the book, responded by saying, no, we should accommodate. We should think that turns out that stranger starvation is something worth caring about. It is worth caring about whether or not you're spatio-temporally connected to starving strangers. As far as I can tell, again, the way of reform was never on the table for Lewis or the critics. So, yeah, and I think this attitude, which is kind of normal practice in philosophy, is kind of boring, and I don't want to go into it. I think if you have this sort of antecedent methodological commitment to never reforming, you're not. I wonder what the point of doing philosophy is. Anyway, there's more to be said there, but let's just say that I'm not going to go that way. So in the book, as a sort of methodological commitment of mine, is I'm going to avoid, if possible, base denial and base accommodation. If we have independent reasons to deny or accommodate, then that's going to be fine. Otherwise, I say we should reform. Okay. The first part of the book is about chaos and delicate counterfactuals. The second is about the ontology of crowds. Okay, so the big idea we're going to look at is one, again, that many of you may be familiar with, sometimes called the plenitude. So for these purposes, just think of it like this. Suppose we just acknowledge 3 massive population explosions. The first involves acknowledging the existence of physically proximate things that share most, but not all of their parts. So on your handout, I've given an account like this. So in the vicinity of any person, there are many, many person-like things with ever so slightly different material composition. So wherever David Attenborough goes, there's another large thing, which we'll call hairless Attenborough, and he goes too. So David Attenborough's hair is at least arguably a part of him, but David Attenborough's hair is not a part of hairless Attenborough. Hairless Attenborough kind of wears David Attenborough's hair the way that you might wear a cap or a furry suit. Otherwise, hairless Attenborough is very much like Attenborough. Okay, so for these purposes, we're going to call hairless Attenborough a person-apt myriological subber of Attenborough. To say that he's a myriological subber is just to say that he's a proper part of David Attenborough. To say he's person-apt is to say that he's intrinsically qualified to be a person. If hairless Attenborough fails to be a person, it's only in virtue of the fact that he has this hair attached to him. Put another way, there's a nearby possible world in which David Attenborough has no hair, in which something intrinsically just like hairless Attenborough is a person. So if hairless Attenborough fails to be a person, it's not in virtue of his intrinsic features, it's in virtue of extrinsic features. There's all this hair growing out of hairless Attenborough's scalp. Okay, this is a sort of doctrine that follows from a more general metaphysical doctrine of unrestricted material composition, the view that for any collection of material objects, there's an object that's composed of only the things in that collection. Okay, fine. So then we have this vast explosion of Attenborough-like things and Max-like things and Jonathan-like things and so on and so forth. The next sort of explosion that I'm interested in the book comes with acknowledging the existence of things that are presently and momentarily just the same, but they have different pasts and futures. I call this the tensed explosion. So in the vicinity of any person, there are many, many person-like things with all the same present-oriented properties, but ever so slightly different past and future-oriented properties. So present-oriented properties are intuitively the kinds of properties I have in virtue of the way I am right now. So a present-oriented property of me is that I'm sitting. A past-oriented property is a property that I have in virtue of the way I was. That I had breakfast this morning is a past-oriented property of me. Future-oriented property is a property that I have in virtue of the way I will be. That I will return to the UK at some point is a future-oriented property of me. Obviously, there's an interesting question about exactly what makes for a present-oriented property. Is having such and such a velocity really a present-oriented property or not? Let's not worry about that now. So the claim is that here, as me, I have certain present-oriented properties and certain future and past-oriented properties, and there's a thing that shares all my present-oriented properties, but has different past-oriented properties. For example, call that young Caspar. So young Caspar was not around yesterday. Young Caspar, so to speak, came into existence at midnight of last night. But as far as the future is concerned, young Caspar is just like Caspar. As far as the present is concerned, young Caspar is just like Caspar. But young Caspar and Caspar have different parts. So on your handout, I've got Attenborough and young Attenborough. Attenborough existed 50 years ago. Young Attenborough didn't. Otherwise, young Attenborough is just like Attenborough. So we're going to call young Attenborough a person-apt tensed subber of Attenborough. Person-apt because, again, there is a nearby possible world in which an Attenborough-like thing gets created kind of ex nihilo in a sort of old state and then lives out the rest of its life. And that's definitely a person. And it's intrinsically just like young Attenborough. So young Attenborough is, so to speak, temporarily intrinsically suited to be a person, and a subber of Attenborough because young Attenborough's history intuitively is a subset of Attenborough's history. Those notions can be made more precise, but that's the basic idea. Finally, we're going to acknowledge the existence of things. So after the tensed explosion, the mereological explosion, we have one more explosion, which is the modal explosion, where we acknowledge the existence of things with all the same non-modal features, but different modal features. Modal features are features having to do with the way things you could, de re modal features, have to do with the way things could have been for you, things would have been for you, things might have been for you, and so on and so forth. So the modal explosion, according to that, it says, in the vicinity of any person, there are many, many person-like things with all the same present, past, and future-oriented properties, and the same present composition, obviously follows from having the same present-oriented properties, but with ever so slightly different modal properties. So wherever Attenborough goes, another thing, naturalist Attenborough goes too. Although Attenborough could have been something other than a naturalist, naturalist Attenborough couldn't. Naturalist Attenborough is essentially a naturalist. Otherwise, he's just like Attenborough. So naturalist Attenborough is a modal suburb of Attenborough. Not so obvious that naturalist Attenborough is person-apt. Not clear what the criterion would be for deciding whether naturalist Attenborough was person-apt. That's not going to matter. Okay, so my question is not so much whether or not these views are right, but what follows from believing them to be true. That's the question. Okay, and we're going to focus now, in particular, on the mereological explosion. In the book, I'm also interested in sort of more exotic problems that come about if you acknowledge the tensed explosion and the modal explosion. But let's just right now, for these purposes, focus on the mereological explosion. Okay, so at first blush, you might think that the mereological explosion makes hedonic considerations to do with the quality of your experiences, people's experiences, much more important, much more rationally weighty than they previously were. So consider this unpleasant story, call it the mishap. So I learn from the radio of an explosion at a local factory. Acid splashed on Harry's face. Harry is in terrible pain. So this is a bad thing. I should feel bad about it. If I were in a position to do something about it, then I have some reasons to do something about it. Maybe they're not compelling reasons. I may have reasons to do other things as well, but I at least have a reason to go over to the factory, which is that I can help Harry. Okay, now suppose that the story goes on. I call this the bigger mishap. Now more news comes in from the radio. The explosion was bigger than we first thought. Turns out that acid splashed on Harry's face and also on Harriet's face. So two people are in terrible pain. This, prima facie, you might think, is worse. I should feel worse about it than I did before. My reasons, as far as I had reasons to do something about it before, the reasons I have now are more pressing. What would that mean? If beforehand I was on the fence, I was right on the edge about whether to go to the factory, balancing the certain inconvenience to me against the small chance my presence would be helpful to Harry, now I should go to the factory. The balancer's reasons has been tipped. Okay, phew. Now suppose the story continues one more wrinkle. News comes in from the philosophy seminar room. There's been a mereological explosion. In the near vicinity of Harry and Harriet, there are many further personish things. Each of these many personish things is in terrible pain. Question, is this still worse? Should I feel still worse about it? Are my reasons to do something about it still more pressing than before? You might think, yeah, maybe that's so. Maybe it's now massively obvious that I should go over to the factory. After all, the general moral of the mishap and the bigger mishap is that it's always worse, other things being equal, that more things suffer. So I have stronger, more pressing reasons to prevent more things suffering than to prevent fewer things suffering. But when I learn of the mereological explosion, I learn that in this situation, many, many, many more things were suffering than I thought. So in addition to Harry and Harriet, we've got hairless Harry. That's the H person, an H person being a hairless person, in Harry's near vicinity. And there's also eyebrowless Harry, and there's also pinkyless Harry, and so on and so forth. And many, many other things beside. So this situation is much worse than I thought. My reasons to help are much more pressing than I thought. Okay, now you might say, what one sort of natural reaction is to concede this and say, but it doesn't really matter, because it can be that I've got extra reasons to go over to the factory, but maybe I've also, mereological explosion also generates extra reasons for me to stay home. After all, remember, I was balancing pain to experienced by Hare against the inconvenience and frustration experienced by me if I go over to the factory and I'm with no help. And learning, of course, that Hare has many subbers who are in pain. Along with that comes my learning that I have many subbers who will experience frustration if I go over and help. And so you might think this all, that what's happening is that reasons have got weightier on either side of the scale, but the balance has stayed the same. But that's not necessarily right for two reasons. Firstly, it may be that my reasons for staying at home were not hedonic reasons. Maybe I wanted to stay home because I was trying to prove something in math. And my strong desire was that it be proved. I cared very much about whether a particular theorem was proved. I didn't care about whether it was proved by one person or by a gazillion, or proved by one entity or a gazillion entities. What I cared about was whether it was proved. Now, by multiplying the hedonic considerations in favor of going over to the factory, we haven't correspondingly multiplied the considerations in favor of me staying home, because I don't care about whether the theorem is proved by one or proved by a gazillion. So it seems like hedonic considerations have become much, much more powerful than certain other kinds of considerations. And furthermore, the balance of hedonic considerations hasn't necessarily stayed the same. So now, what you think will have happened to the balance of hedonic considerations depends on whether you think people have infinitely many proper parts or finitely many proper parts. If people have infinitely many proper parts, then Hare has infinitely many subbers, mereological subbers. Indeed, actually, Hare has an uncountable infinity, that's a lot, of mereological subbers. And then I learn that no matter whether or not one person suffers or two people suffer, there's going to be infinitely many subbers suffering either way, in fact, an uncountable infinity of subbers suffering either way. And it would seem like the number, and that's also true whether one person suffers or a million people suffer. It would seem like Torek was right then, that the numbers just don't count when it comes to suffering. If, on the other hand, people have finitely many proper parts, then we have to face this sort of curious fact that enormously many more person-apt mereological subbers suffer when bigger people suffer than when smaller people suffer. So let's just suppose, to illustrate the idea, that Max has, that Jonathan is one atom more massive than Max. So Max is composed of n atoms, and Jonathan is composed of n+1 atoms. And turns out that that means that Max has 2 to the power of n minus 2 mereological subbers. Jonathan has 2 to the power of n+1 minus 2 mereological subbers. So Jonathan has almost twice as many mereological subbers, in fact, sorry, just over twice as many mereological subbers as Max has. That's when Jonathan has just one atom more in his body than Max. If Jonathan has 2 atoms more in his body than Max, then he has like 4 times as many subbers. If he has 3, then he has 8 times as many subbers. What does this mean? This means that if, say, the most massive person in the world is 1 kilo heavier than the next most massive person in the world, and if the atoms, what we call atoms, were actually, I'm going to idealize, let's suppose they were proper partless things. Of course, they aren't in reality proper partless things. There are subatomic particles, but let's just suppose the atoms of which he was composed were proper partless things. It would turn out that there were enormously more subbers, were subbers of the most massive parts of the world than were subbers of all other people in the world combined. And when I say enormously large, to write down the factor like, you know, in decimal notation, in 10-point font, the number would stretch from like more than one side of the Milky Way galaxy to the other. It's an enormous number. Combinatorics is amazing. And it means virtually 100% of person-apt subbers in the world are subbers of the most massive person in the world. So it would seem that the most massive person in the world, and it is, I don't quite know who it is, but it's almost certainly a he, and his subbers have become this utility monstrous army, and we should do absolutely everything that we can to improve the hedonic condition of him and his subbers, because there are just so overwhelmingly many of them, if we care about numbers at all. And all of us, to some degree, care about numbers. And that, of course, and then, of course, that's true if we think that we only care about the hedonic state of people and people-like things. If we are more generous and we extend our concern to include other creatures, we should all be prostrating ourselves at the feet of the one great blue whale somewhere out there in the Pacific Ocean, such that almost all creature subbers are subbers of that one creature. Okay, good. So yeah, seems like first blush, mereological explosion has changed a ton of stuff of practical importance. Let's turn to the epistemic side of things. Okay, so this is section 6 in your handout. Page 4. So this looks like a good principle of epistemic rationality. Call it the Day-Say distribution principle. If I know that I'm an F, and that X% of the F's a G, then absent any further evidence that bears on whether I'm a G, I should be X% confident that I'm G. So if I know that I'm, you know, sorry, if I know that I'm a philosopher and that 30% of philosophers were born on a Wednesday, and I have no further evidence concerning whether I was born on a Wednesday or not. Of course, sorry, this is not the best example because I do have further evidence, but suppose I didn't, then I should be 30% confident that I was born on a Wednesday. Okay, looks like a good principle. Pretty much every epistemologist is going to accept that. But now look, we'll try to apply it to this case. After learning of the mereological explosion, I know, here's one thing I know. I know I'm a sentient thing interacting in this sort of weird virtual way with philosophers at the University of Sheffield. And I know that the overwhelming majority of such things are person-apt mereological subbers. I mean, almost 100% of them are person-apt mereological subbers, not people. And I have no further evidence concerning whether I'm a person-apt mereological subber or a person. I mean, what would that be? What evidence could I have concerning whether I was a person or a person-apt mereological subber? So the principle appears to say that I should be overwhelmingly confident that I'm a person-apt mereological subber, not a person. Now, you may say, well, yeah, but that doesn't really matter because, I mean, I still should believe that I'm in Somerville. I still should believe, you know, that I'm kind of around here. It doesn't really change very much. But sometimes beliefs that say about where I am are going to have to change too. So here's the example you've got on your handout, the big house. So imagine I wake up in the dark, confused. What happened? Who am I? How did I get here? I have no idea. But a voice from a microphone, one of these voices that doesn't, unfortunately, tells me sort of, doesn't allow me to pin down perfectly where I am. It sheds some light on my situation. It tells me this and nothing more. I'm in a big house. 3 people in the house. Alice is in the west wing. Bella is in the central hall. Kate is in the east wing. Before learning of the crowds, that principle, the Day-Say distribution principle, told me that I should be a third confident that I'm Alice. Afterwards, suppose I think that people have infinitely many parts. Then the principle doesn't appear to tell me anything useful because there's no interesting sense in which a third of the person-apt mereological subbers are in the west wing. If I think that people have finitely many parts on the other hand, and I happen to think that Alice is bigger than Bella and Kate, then I should be overwhelmingly, let's say almost 100% confident that I'm Alice, because almost all of the person-apt mereological suburbs in this house are suburbs of Alice. Or at least, if I'm not overwhelmingly confident that I'm Alice, I should be overwhelmingly confident that I'm in the vicinity of Alice. I'm a suburb of Alice. Then, curiously, if I think that people have finitely many parts, and I don't know who's bigger, and then I learn that I'm Alice, then I should become, this is just by sort of Bayes' theorem, overwhelmingly confident that I, Alice, am bigger than Bella and Kate. More generally, it seems to follow that if you find yourself like in an elevator with a stranger, then absent further evidence, you should be overwhelmingly confident that you're bigger than the stranger. And that if you briefly forgot who you were, your first attitude prior to any evidence coming in should be that you're the fattest person in the world. And you should be almost 100% confident of that. Okay, good. So you may think, I'm taking it you're going to think, this is just like crazy. Obviously, this is not right. Something's going wrong here. And I agree something is going wrong here. But I'm going to talk about what I think is the right way to respond to this and what I think is the wrong way to respond. So the first kind of response you might have is this. Look, you might say these claims are just absurd. These claims about us all prostrating ourselves before the one great whale, or us all believing ourselves to be large. This is stupid. If they follow from the conjunction of some metaphysical theories and some moral and epistemological principles, then so much the worse for that conjunction. We have a reductio ad absurdum of that conjunction. We should go like G. Moore and just say, we've just proved that there's something wrong with either the metaphysical theories or the moral and epistemological principles. Now, that's either base accommodation if you're rejecting the moral and epistemological principles, or base denial if you're rejecting the metaphysical theories. And I'm just not going to go that way, and I find it unsatisfactory. A further thing you could say is look, person-apt mereological suburbs, they're not people, so their suffering doesn't matter, and you know you aren't one of them. You know you're a person, and you know that only the suffering of people matter. This seems like it's scarcely less base. I mean, you're just adding in that I know that I'm a person without explanation. How do I know that I'm a person? What grounds have I got for thinking that I'm a person? This seems, you could just sort of insist on it, but it suddenly seems that more would need to be said if this isn't just another form of base denial or base accommodation. You could say, in an effort to sort of give some substance to that, what you just said there, you could say person-apt mereological suburbs, they aren't sentient. So they don't suffer, and you know you aren't one of them. So hairless Hare is not, in fact, suffering, and is not conscious, isn't sentient. Again, this seems to me like just more base accommodation. I mean, certainly hairless Hare has got, hairless Hare has a face which is covered with acid. Hairless Hare is screaming. Nerves from, from pain receptors in hairless Hare's skin are like sending signals to his brain that is causing a reaction that if you described it to a scientist and you said, is this pain? They would almost certainly say yes. What are we saying when we're saying, oh, hairless Hare isn't really conscious? I mean, maybe you could say consciousness is something that's exclusively sort of the domain of the person. There's something very like it, which is what hairless Hare is, the state that hairless Hare is in. Call it consciousness star. In fact, Ted Sider once wanted to say this. I said that suburbs aren't conscious, but they are conscious star. But then there is, and something that's conscious star is something that's intrinsically suited to be conscious, but fails to be conscious in virtue of being part of a further conscious thing. But then you have this further question, why does consciousness, star, not matter? Why do we care about consciousness, but not care about consciousness, star? How do I know that I'm conscious and not conscious, star? And we have no answers as yet to these questions. Okay, so you might say, okay, why do we need answers? These, what answers could you possibly hope to get? And I think that that's a reaction that many people have at this point. And I feel that a way of seeing the way in which answers could be better is to focus on a different sorts of examples. So imagine that you're in charge of the University of Sheffield Art Museum, and you've got a picture, and you've got like a Van Gogh in your museum. It's the prize. It's the absolute. You know, it's the centerpiece of the museum. You've got this wonderful Van Gogh. It's like, you know, I don't know. It's like Wheatfield under the stars. Okay, and imagine I said to you, wow, I've made this incredible discovery in the bowels of the University of Sheffield Art Museum. I found this other Van Gogh painting, right? And it's wonderful. This is amazing. You would, of course, be overjoyed. You'd be like, whoa, this is the greatest day in the history of the University of Sheffield Art Museum. Suppose I said to you this, wow, I've just discovered through my philosophy seminar that there's been this incredible meteorological explosion. And in addition to Wheatfield under the stars, you actually have possession of Wheatfield under the stars minus that little dab of paint to the bottom right of it. Should you be equally overjoyed as you were about discovering about a new Van Gogh painting? I take it you shouldn't. You don't think, oh, well, I would be massively overjoyed. In explaining why you're not overjoyed, do you have to say something like, this new thing you've discovered isn't a painting, right? No, that would be a sort of pathetically inadequate thing to say. There are many, many, many like further, more illustrative, more helpful things that you can just say than just saying, oh, well, it's not a painting, so I don't care about it. You can say, look, I care about like the commercial value of what I've got, what the University of Sheffield has, and I can't sell these two things for any different price than I can sell the one thing. I care about the sort of viewer experience of visitors to the art museum, and the two things make for no better a visual experience than the one thing. I care about you know, the testimony to a particular time in the life of Van Gogh, and the two things together are no greater testimony to a particular time in the life of Van Gogh than the one thing. There are all these substantive things that you can say that go just beyond the kind of base accommodation or base denial view of saying it's not a painting. And so similarly, I think that there are many things that we can say here that will be more substantive and more informative than just base denial or base accommodation. Okay, so this is the key idea behind what I think is a more satisfactory reply to both worries. So there are some things that, this is on page 5 of your handout. Standard in philosophy of perception to distinguish between things of which we are directly perceptually aware and things of which we are indirectly perceptually aware. So my perception, my sight, my touch, my hearing, and so on and so forth, they, in virtue of perception, I become aware of things. Some things I become aware of indirectly. So I became aware of the sun this morning in virtue of seeing like a shadow cast on the wall of my bedroom. How did I become aware of the sun? Well, I saw the shadow and the light on the wall of the bedroom, and then I inferred that that must have been emitted by the sun, and so on and so forth. There was this kind of indirect path from the sun to my awareness of it by way of perception. I became aware of a bolt of lightning outside, you know, a couple of hours ago. How did I become aware of that? Well, I saw it. I just directly saw it. There's nothing, there's no indirect path there. Okay. So here is so call the things of which we're directly aware by way of vision, hearing, smell, feel, taste, or proprioception are perceptual objects. here's a claim about Hare and Hairless Hare. Shared perceptual objects. A person, generally, and her person-apt mereological subbers have all the same perceptual objects. So, for example, everything Hare is directly aware of through sight, hearing, smell, feel, taste, or proprioception, Hairless Hare is directly aware of through sight, hearing, taste, feel, smell, or proprioception, and vice versa. Now, some people think that the only things of which we're directly aware are things we're directly aware of through perception. Other people think, oh no, there can be things of which we're directly aware that we're not directly aware of through perception, like thoughts. We're directly aware of our thoughts. How do I know what I'm thinking? I just know. I'm aware of my thoughts, but I'm not, so to speak, seeing them or hearing them or touching them, but I'm in some other way directly aware of them. To accommodate that, thought will state a more general claim, call it shared objects of direct awareness. A person and her person-apt mereological subbers are directly aware of all the same things. Okay, so armed with that claim, we can now first assuage the epistemic worries. Okay, suppose you find yourself in a sort of the big house situation with Alice and Bella and Kate and all that, one of these situations where you don't know who you are. And you have this question, who and where am I? That's the question you naturally articulate in those terms. Suppose you were pressed to articulate the thought in other terms, expand on the thought, other terms not including I. What would you say? So the sort of first pass, if you just look, you could look at the dictionary. Merriam-Webster says I is the one who is speaking and writing. So you might just say, who and where is the one who is speaking and writing? That's obviously pretty inadequate because maybe nobody's speaking. In fact, by assumption, nobody's speaking. You're on your own. You're not talking to yourself. You're certainly not writing. Maybe better would be, who and where is the one who is thinking? After all, you are having thoughts. But of course, that isn't still a very good question because you know that the world contains billions of people who are thinking. So there isn't one who is thinking. Still better would be to include some kind of indexical component. Who and where is the one who is thinking these thoughts? So there's certain thoughts with which we're confronted, and you're asking who and where is the one who's thinking them? Still better still would be who and where is the one who has all and only these things as objects of direct awareness? Because we concede that in addition to ostending thoughts, pointing to these thoughts, we can also point to things and ask who and where is the one who is directly aware of all and only these things. That seems to me a pretty good gloss on the question that we're asking and that we might, in sort of simpler terms, articulate as who and where am I? But the problem is, once I've become enlightened and seen and discovered of the mereological explosion, I now realize this was a bad question. So there's a presupposition failure in this question. So it's not that there isn't one thing that has all and only these things as objects of direct awareness. There are many things. So I must ask new questions. And the sort of questions that spring to mind are, well, first this one. Who and where is the person who has all and only these things as object of direct awareness? In short, who and where am I person? Also, I could ask, who and where is the hairless person who has all and only these things as object of direct awareness? In short, who and where am I hairless person? Each person. I could ask, what's the collection of things that have all and only these things as objects of direct awareness? And where are the things in the collection located? In short, what and where is I collection? These would all be fine questions to ask, fine substitutes for my sort of my unhelpful original question. And note that for each of them, there are just 3 possible answers. So on any way of reconstruing the Day-Saved distribution principle in light of a more articulate notion of I, a more helpful notion of I, one that works after we acknowledge the existence of the mereological explosion, I should distribute my credence evenly between just 3 possibilities. So irrespective of whether Alice is big or small, my confidence that I person am in the West Wing should be a third. My confidence that I H person am in the West Wing should be a third. And my confidence that I collection am in the West Wing should be a third. So on no sort of new disambiguation of I, one that works in light of the mereological explosion, is there an interesting question about whether I'm a person or a supper? Am I a person? Am I a person a person? Yes. Am I a collection a person? No, of course not. A collection isn't a person. Am I each person a person? No. I'm a each person, not a person. Okay. Then look now at the worries about suffering. Okay, so here I'm going to give you an argument from the key idea about the shared objects of direct awareness. Hare and all of his subbers having all his person-apt mereological subbers having all and only the same, sorry, all the same objects of direct awareness. To the conclusion that when you learn of hairless Hare suffering in addition to Hare, you don't learn of anything further that's bad. So I'm going to put it in this premise and conclusion form just so that you can kind of easily follow it. The first premise is just that Hare and hairless have all the same objects of direct awareness. The second premise has to do with this activity of imagining being another creature. There's lots of ways of imagining being another creature, but there's what I call phenomenal-centered imagining. For you to fully imagine being a sentient creature in the phenomenal-centered way just is for you to imagine for each of its objects of direct awareness, having that as an object of direct awareness, and for you to imagine having no further objects of direct awareness. So I want to imagine being in the phenomenal-centered way Napoleon at Austerlitz. I just imagine seeing the battle. I imagine feeling his hand against the chest. I imagine the generals. I imagine being directly aware of horses neighing and so on and so on and so forth. And then if I imagine having all of Napoleon's objects of direct awareness as objects of direct awareness, and I do it successfully, right, then I have fully and comprehensively succeeded in my task of imagining being Napoleon in the phenomenal-centered way. There may be other ways to imagine being things. Some people tell me, oh, I can imagine being a brick. And they've got something other than phenomenal-centered imagination in mind there. I'm not so sure what on earth they do have in mind. I don't think I can, in any interesting sense, imagine being a brick. But some people say they can imagine being a brick. And so I've got to concede that there may be other ways of imagining being things. Doesn't matter. We're focusing on a special way of imagining being somebody, which is phenomenal-centered imagining. Okay. Next premise is just about Hare. Whatever is bad about Hare's suffering is what makes your fully imagining being Hare in the phenomenal-centered way an accurate representation of some aspect of reality. So I imagine being Hare suffering. What does that mean? That it means imagining being directly aware of the skin, the pain, the concern in the eyes of the nurse who's attending, and so on and so forth. If you ask me, try to understand what's bad about what's happening here, I perform that imaginative exercise. And it's not my ability to perform the imaginative exercise. That doesn't tell me that something bad is happening. I can imagine, being disemboweled by a velociraptor or something. That's not bad that I can perform that imaginative exercise. What's bad is that there's something in the world that makes that imaginative exercise accurate, makes it an accurate representation of some aspect of reality. That's not true of my imagining being disemboweled by a velociraptor. There's nothing, at least presently in the world, that makes that an accurate representation of some aspect of reality. Okay. From premise 1 and premise 2, you get the first conclusion, which is that for you to fully imagine being Hare is for you to fully imagine being hairless. For you to fully imagine being Hare is just for you to imagine having all of Hare's objects of direct awareness as objects of direct awareness. But if you've fully imagined, if you imagined having all of Hare's objects of direct awareness as objects of direct awareness, you've also imagined having all of hairless's objects of direct awareness as objects of direct awareness, because they have all the same objects of direct awareness. And from P3, P4, and the first conclusion, we get our final conclusion, which is what is bad about Hare suffering is what's bad about Hairless suffering. So there aren't two independent bad things here, that Hare suffers and that Hairless suffers. When you learn of the suffering of Hairless, you haven't learned that something bad is happening, something you didn't account for when you already accounted for Hare suffering. Okay, so the point about this argument is that it appears to be valid, and the premises, whether or not they're right, are independently motivated. I didn't just think, oh, I believe these premises because I want to somehow get out of the avoid the horrible conclusion that we should all prostrate ourselves before the one great whale. This would be principled accommodation. And this, at least in this case, is, I think, the way to go. Awesome.
Thank you very much, Caspar. And I think I'll mute myself while I applaud, because otherwise you'll get deafened. But thanks very much. Oh, wait, I didn't. Okay. We're now going to take a little break, and we'll reconvene at 3:40 for the Q&A. So if anyone wants to run and get a cup of tea or whatever, now is the time. So I'm just going to do that so I can see everyone else. And thanks again. That was great fun. And really looking forward to discussing it.
Good. Maybe I will also take my.
Max, do you want to stop the recording?